This video is called The End of Negative Green. Over the course of time, pendulum use has become associated with fringe theories of energy. These are theories that sound scientific, but they're not actually scientific. And they stem almost completely from the work of some French pendulum dowsers. Well, they weren't exactly pendulum dowsers. They're more like people who are into energy experimentation. And their names were Andre de Belizal, Leon Chalmarie, and Paul-André Morel. These guys were active from the 50s to the 1970s, roughly. Anyway, over time, their ideas became entrenched within the pendulum dowsing community. And it was mostly among European-influenced pendulum dowsers. This was largely due to the work of several individuals who I won't name here, and also due to lots of websites that talk about radiothesia. The most well-known idea that came from this body of work was the concept of negative green. And it's a hypothetical form of energy that is said to be produced by pyramids and pendulums. And when I first began my work with pendulums, I accepted, or I inherited, this concept of negative green from my predecessors. And I did mention it in my early books, but I was very skeptical of the whole concept, and I presented lots of critiques of the idea. Anyway, over time, I really tried to avoid discussion about the topic of negative green. I felt that negative green was a false concept, that it was a waste of time to really talk about it, and it was diverting people's attention from things that were important. And then also, a lot of people were really fearful about negative green. So I just tried to ignore the whole issue because I just felt it was a waste of time, that it just made people scared unnecessarily, and that it was just ridiculous and not worth discussing. Unfortunately, however, over the years, people keep coming to me and they're fearful of their pendulums hurting them with negative green energy. So I realized that there was just no way I can avoid talking about this topic any longer, and that I just have to clearly lay out my case about why I think negative green is not a true concept, why the evidence is against it. And that way we can move on from this and just not have to talk about it anymore. Now, with this concept, here's one of the papers that's kind of famous that it really was clearly defined in. This video is really only for people who are curious about why negative green could be incorrect. I do not have any hope that I will be able to convince believers of negative green that this concept is flawed. There are people who've invested a lot of time and money paying for trainings to learn about negative green. There are also people whose entire careers and all of their teachings are dependent on this concept being correct. And I know that these people will never accept these ideas. They'll never accept any evidence shown to them that their views are incorrect. So I don't really care what they think. They can believe whatever they want. That's not the point of this video. I'm not trying to convince them that they're wrong. Let them have their concept of negative green. That's fine. This video is for people who are curious about the concept of negative green, or maybe you've heard something about it and you're kind of concerned about it, and you want to know why I think this is a totally false concept that you don't need to worry about. So that's the point of this video. All right, well, let's get into the actual discussion. So what is negative green? This is an area of massive confusion, I have discovered. So in order to really understand it, you have to go back to the original papers. Here's an example of one of them that were written. And unfortunately, these papers are very old. They're from like the 1970s, and they're written in French. So most people have never read these papers. Even most of the experts on negative green do not seem to have read these papers. And what the papers say negative green is that they say that it is the most highly radioactive form of nuclear energy known or that's possible to even exist. It's a hypothetical form of energy. So it's not known or recognized by science, but it was theorized to exist. And it would be in the form of an extreme gamma ray. Now, I know that most of you watching this video haven't taken a physics class in a long time. So I put up this picture here of the electromagnetic energy spectrum. And basically, energy can be thought of as being a continuous spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum, you have things like radio waves, microwaves, radar. Then you have visible light, which is what we think of as being colors. Then you have high energy things like X-rays, radioactive elements like, uranium, thorium, things that are inside of nuclear bombs. And then you have negative green all the way at the end. So what these guys were saying was that negative green was the most highly radioactive form of gamma radiation or ionizing radiation that was possible to exist in the universe. And even though no scientist was aware of it, they believed that they had discovered this, and that this is what their work was based on. Now, the reason why they felt this was so important, so much so that they even put a patent on this idea of negative green, was because they believed that by using objects that had various geometric shapes, like a pyramid or a pendulum, you could harness radioactive energy from the ether. They literally say from the ethers. So they felt like they had rediscovered an ancient technology that they claimed the Egyptians used, that the ancient Egyptians used, and that this was a really amazing and simple way where you could make nuclear energy, light energy, any kind of energy you wanted by creating an object of a particular shape and then using that shape to channel the energy. They basically thought they had invented a way to create free energy that, in the case of negative green, did not require a nuclear reactor or did not require the presence of highly radioactive nuclear elements or things like that, which are very hard to do. It took the greatest minds of the 20th century to figure out how to harness nuclear energy. So they were convinced that they were on to something really big and really important here, and that they had basically found a source of free nuclear energy that they could literally just pull out of the air with these devices that they created. All right, now there is an issue here because radioactivity is highly toxic. And this is why you hear all of these warnings about negative green. It's because negative green was said to be a form of radioactivity, and radioactivity will kill you. And this is why you'll hear all these warnings about negative green. Now, the irony is that when I ask most of these experts why they give these warnings about negative green, they have no clue that it's because the founders of this idea thought it was radioactive. But all the warnings that you hear about negative green are based on the idea that it's highly toxic and it's radioactive and that negative green could potentially kill you. All right, so the question becomes like, well, what evidence do they use to even support this claim that negative green exists? Because that's a pretty bold claim that you could, that you don't need like a nuclear reactor, or you don't need a source of a radioactive element like uranium or plutonium to generate nuclear energy. You can just make a shape like a pendulum or a pyramid, and then somehow get this nuclear energy out of the air and then channel it towards productive uses. All right, so how do they support this claim, this Belazal, Morel, and Chaumery? All right, well, one thing is they created a theory, and the theory predicts it to be true. The next piece of evidence is that they claimed that nuclear emulsion films, this is basically a type of photographic film, they said that it showed evidence of gamma ray particles hitting it after they exposed this film to their negative green emitting shape devices. So they would put this nuclear emulsion film in front of one of their devices, and they claimed that it would show evidence that it had been hit by gamma ray particles. So this indicated that there was nuclear energy present. All right, they also claimed that various types of dowsing instruments, and when I say dowsing, I mean handheld instruments that only move because a person's hand is holding it, were claimed to respond to the presence of negative green. They also reported that negative green had various effects on biological organisms that were in the vicinity of their devices. All right, I'm going to go through each one of these lines of evidence and show you why it's flawed, or why they are flawed. All right, well, the first thing is that, theories are really great. I mean, you can come up with some really amazing theories, but the problem is that unless you actually have evidence supporting that theory, it's just an idea. In the history of science, there are so many great ideas that people have that in theory, it would be true. But when you actually test it out in reality, it doesn't turn out to be true at all. So a theory in itself is not enough to provide evidence that negative green is real. And this is one of the big mistakes that I see perpetuated by the experts on negative green. They mostly rely on theories to support their ideas, but theories, yeah, that's great that you have this beautiful theory that seems to prove itself. But honestly, you have to actually take observations from nature and do testing and show that the theory is correct through evidence. You can't just make assumptions that it's true because theoretically it's correct. All right, well, let's just say, they have this beautiful theory, but unfortunately, even the theory itself is like wildly inaccurate. And I want to just show you a few examples. So where did they come up with this name of negative green? Well, what they did was they created this color wheel, which you can see in this picture. And in the color wheel, green on the top is opposite negative green on the bottom. So they said, well, since green is opposite this energy down here, we're just going to call this energy negative green. And this is the basis of their theory. Now, this is a very strange energy wheel, because it has infrared light indicated, and then it has the visible spectrum of light shown, and then it has ultraviolet, but it's missing several types of energy that are extremely important scientifically. So there's no X-rays, no gamma rays, no radio waves, no microwaves, and instead they put the terms white and black, and these are not forms of energy at all. And then they put this hypothetical form of energy in the middle called negative green. So right away, there's a problem here. Another thing is that the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum is actually very small compared proportionately to the rest of the spectrum. So let me go back here and just try to show you. So when you're looking at the energy spectrum, visible light is only a very narrow part of the spectrum, but in their diagram, they greatly expand this part of the spectrum, and it pretty much dominates the diagram. All right, well, let's take a look at what this diagram would look like if it was actually accurate and in scale. And this is what it would look like. You would have this giant area of radio waves. Then you'd have microwaves, infrared light, then you'd have colored light, and green would be in the center of that. Then you'd have a region of ultraviolet light, X-rays, gamma rays, and then negative green would be right here at the end, because they said that negative green was the strongest type of gamma radiation, meaning it would be at the very end of the energy spectrum, and that would be right here, because then the energy spectrum would start over again. It would go from the highest frequency to the lowest frequency. So take a look. Now, negative green is no longer opposite green. It's somewhere between infrared and microwaves. So right away, this whole idea that negative green is opposite green is like completely absurd. Their scale is completely out of proportion. It's totally inaccurate. And it's missing very important forms of electromagnetic energy. So if their devices are really gathering electromagnetic energy out of the ether, they would have to also be able to get microwaves, gamma rays, X-rays, etc. But they don't include that at all in their diagram. So this is a serious, serious problem. All right, well, there's another problem too in their little diagrams. And another problem is that they have these Greek letters, and you may have seen these on the universal pendulum. They talk about them in their papers. And here is white on the top, here's black on the bottom, and here's negative green. And what they're saying is that in this region between white and black on their chart, which would be, if they were actually being scientifically accurate, between gamma rays and radio waves, they're saying that there is a region here centered around negative green. And that this region, every little part of this region has a specific type of energy. Now, if you were to literally read their chart, as I show here on the left, it should go from high frequency to the end of the spectrum, and then it should show low frequency. And I accidentally have one low frequency mark in there, but that should be high. Okay, so because you go from the high frequencies and then you get to the highest part of the spectrum ends, and then it should go to the lowest part of the spectrum again so that it can build up. All right, that's not what they have indicated when you read their papers. They have the opposite. They say that as you approach the highest frequency or the strongest energy of the spectrum, you have the lowest frequency energies. And then after the spectrum ends, the frequencies suddenly become high. And so this makes absolutely no sense. This is completely irrational and illogical and is flawed. All right. So right away, there are serious problems here with this diagram they've created. It's totally out of scale. It's not proportional. Then this regions that they claim of high and low frequencies, they have them flipped based on a literal reading of their charts. All right, well, what else is wrong with this negative green concept? Right, well, here is probably the most, damning evidence, or the fatal blow to the whole concept of negative green. On the left, here is a Geiger counter, and Geiger counters are used to detect gamma radiation and the presence of radioactive particles. And on the right is a drawing of one of their machines that they use to create negative green energy. And what they say in their paper is that our machines create negative green, but the negative green is not detectable by Geiger counters. So our machines create gamma radiation, our shape machines, like pyramids, pendulums, etc. But they emit gamma radiation. They're giving off nuclear energy, but this nuclear energy is not detectable by a Geiger counter, which is a machine that is designed to detect nuclear energy. So right away, this is a paradox. If these shape emitters are creating, if they're pulling nuclear energy out of the ether and emitting it, why isn't it being detected by the Geiger counter? All right, well, in order to explain this, they come up with a fantastic theory. They say that the gamma radiation being given off is only composed of magnetic wavelengths, or largely composed of magnetic wavelengths, and that there is almost no electric wavelength, and therefore the gamma rays are not being detected by the Geiger counter, because the Geiger counter only can detect electromagnetic energy. So just for those of you who aren't savvy on physics or aren't up on your physics, here's a picture showing electric waves and magnetic waves. And what is known scientifically is that whenever you have a moving magnetic field, such as a gamma ray, it creates an electric field. Magnetic wavelengths and electric wavelengths create each other. They never exist independently in nature. So to justify their claim that nuclear energy is being given off by these shape objects they've created, they discount the Geiger counter. They say, no, that's not correct. And the reason why is we're going to create a totally new theory of energy that goes against all the known laws of physics. And we're going to say that the electric wavelength is separate from the magnetic wavelength and that the Geiger counter is not detecting it for that reason. All right, so they create a fantastic claim here that is totally unsupported by all of modern science. And if they actually had figured out a way to separate the electric field from the magnetic field, they would have won the Nobel Prize in physics, because the person who discovered the electric and magnetic fields being together did win the Nobel Prize. And it's obvious that they believed in what they were doing, and they thought they might win a prize or become rich because they patented this idea. They said that they didn't even have a patent about this. So that meant they were staking a claim to it either for fame or fortune. All right, so right away, this is very suspect. And as Carl Sagan used to say, fantastic claims require, strong evidence, good evidence, right? All right, so what is their evidence that this is happening? They say, okay, well, the Geiger counter is not detecting anything, but we are convinced that it's magnetic form of gamma radiation being given off. And we can prove this by the use of photographic film. So there is a type of photographic film called nuclear emulsion film that when you put it in the presence of gamma radiation, it will make dark spots on it. So that's what this diagram here on the left is showing. So you put this film near a source of gamma radiation and you'll get dark spots on the film. If you put the film near a source that does not have any form of gamma radiation or radiation, the film won't become darkened in this way. So they got pictures of film. Now let me show you their film. So on the left, this is their film. And on the right, this is an actual nuclear emulsion film that actually had real gamma radiation exposed to it. All right, so what do you notice right away? Their claim that these spots represent gamma radiation is false, because these spots are light colored. They're not dark. When you look at an actual nuclear emulsion film, the spots created by gamma radiation are dark, whereas on their film, the spots are light. So what happened here? Well, Belizal and Morel did not record gamma radiation. They recorded dust or mold that got onto their negatives, and they photographed that, and then they thought it was radiation. And the proof for this is that their so-called gamma ray spots are completely the wrong color. They should be dark. Instead, they're light. So they deluded themselves. The Geiger counter said it wasn't radiation, but they saw these spots on the film, and then they said, well, it must be radiation because the spots are there. But the evidence points to the Geiger counter being correct. There was no radiation, and instead they photographed dust and then deluded themselves into thinking this was negative green energy. All right, so right there, that is the nail in the coffin of negative green. Negative green is now a dead concept. It is based on completely flawed observations. The theory of negative green is also flawed. So we could stop right there if we wanted to, but I'm going to keep going just to really just debunk this concept completely. All right, now the next thing is that negative green and these energies that are supposedly being created by shapes are only detectable with what are essentially dowsing instruments. Things like the virtual cone pendulum on the left, the universal pendulum on the right, Lecture antennas, things of that nature. These are handheld devices, And the only way these devices move is if a human unconsciously moves their hands in response to something. Now, the problem is that these instruments are very easily biased. You can easily make any result you want if you believe in it. And that's the problem with pendulum dowsing. Pendulum dowsing is not an objective way to get information. And that is why I always say you have to check your results from pendulum dowsing against real world data, against real world observations. Because you can very easily deceive yourself with pendulum dowsing and think that something is true when it's not true. And that's what I believe happened here. So you have these guys, they come up with this theory, you know, about energy being mostly magnetic with some electric. They come up with this great negative green idea. They patent the idea. They think they're going to get famous and wealthy off of this. They think that they have revolutionized science. So then they work out the entire theory, and the only independent source of data that they have checking this are the nuclear emotion films, which turn out to have been misinterpreted. And the only other checks they do is with dowsing. So what I think happened is that they thought they had discovered something, they believed it. So then when they used these instruments, they of course reflected their personal bias in the use of these instruments. It became a feedback loop where whatever they thought was going to be true according to their theory would become true because their hand would unconsciously move the device in that direction. Now you could say, well, what if a person independently tests it out? Well, the problem is in order to even use these devices, you have to learn how to use the device. You have to learn about the theory. And when you do that, you become inculcated or you become brainwashed, and then you think the theory is true. So of course you get the same result that they get. Also, if somebody is naive and picks up one of these devices and gets a different result, it's very easy to discredit it and say, well, that person doesn't know how to use the device, or that person doesn't know what they're doing. So there's really no way to falsify this data. So while, you know, pendulum dowsing is very interesting, it can provide great insights, it is not a conclusive or authoritative form of data. And you need to have a non-pendulum or non-dowsing way to check for the presence of this negative green in order for this hypothesis to have any strength. So until they can show using an instrument that's not held by somebody's hands that negative green, that there's evidence that negative green exists, it's just an idea right now. And most of the evidence, the evidence is strongly against it at this point. Okay, let's go to the next source of data, which is also pretty bad. This data is in the form of stories, these very dubious stories that these authors tell. And none of these have ever been independently verified. So the most famous one is that this guy, Leon Chamery, that he died of exposure to negative green. And they claim to have found his corpse mummified in like his house or lab or something like that. All right, so right away, we got a problem here because like, where is the autopsy report? You know, what medical doctor confirmed that he was actually poisoned by radiation poisoning? Also, radiation is not known to mummify people. That's sort of a new claim that they're making. It's not known. Like, how do we know he just didn't die of a heart attack and then through some freak occurrence got mummified? Like maybe his house was really dry or something, or maybe it was very warm and dry in there and then he just naturally became mummified somehow. Who knows? Or maybe he wasn't mummified at all. Maybe they just imagined that he was mummified because they wanted their theory to be true. I mean, I find it very suspicious that he was mummified, given that they claim this technology came from ancient Egypt. It was like, were they trying to say that like this is how they created the mummies in the past? It seems like a very bizarre way to die. And it's very convenient that it happens to be the same thing that happened, like the same preservation technique used by ancient Egyptians. It sounds very fishy to me. It sounds very, very strange. Okay, another thing that's really bizarre is that they claim that these negative green emitters are giving off mostly the magnetic form of energy. But when you read their paper, they say that the electric form of the energy is the harmful form. So how was it then that the Geiger counter didn't detect the electric form of the negative green? Because they said it didn't detect negative green because it was mostly magnetic. But then they say that Leon Schaumburg got killed by it, and that means there must have been the electric form, which they say is dangerous. So why is it that these emitters are sometimes putting out the electric form and sometimes the magnetic form? And why is it that the Geiger counter didn't detect the electric form? So, I mean, other than the fact that the idea that there can be separate electric and magnetic wavelengths of energy is completely against everything known about science, I mean, their story is just completely inconsistent. It doesn't make any sense at all. All right, here's another example of that. They claim that someone stuck their finger in front of one of these things and it burned the skin on their finger, that the negative green burned the skin and the skin turned black, and that it didn't hurt at all, but then after a few days, the skin fell off and they were healed. All right, well, this is completely inconsistent with the way that gamma radiation actually burns things. So if negative green is a form of gamma radiation doesn't produce surface burns. Gamma radiation goes deep into the tissue because gamma radiation can pass right through solid objects. It can go through several inches of lead. It can go through concrete walls that are several inches thick or several feet thick. So it's not going to be stopped by human skin at all. It's going to go right, the gamma rays are going to go right through the human skin, and the burning will be internal. It's not an external burn, it's internal radiation damage. The other thing is that they said the wound was painless, and everything I read about radiation burns is that when you have a surface burn from a weaker form of radiation that's not as strong as a gamma ray, it's extremely painful. So their description is not consistent at all with what radiation burns are like. All right, they claim that they were able to cauterize wounds, like basically like burn a wound and make it like sealed shut by sterilizing it and mummifying it. And they claim they did this on people whose limbs were amputated. I mean, that sounds to me like a really far-fetched, wild story. Gamma radiation would not do that. This is completely fantasy. Yeah. So there would have to be an independent test of that, a medical journal article, some kind of scientific research that shows this. To claim this is a bold claim that's completely fantastic and totally unsupported and sounds totally far-fetched. All right, curing cancer. I mean, maybe, who knows? They claim that their negative green emitters scared rats. Well, what if the rats were scared of them? I mean, that's not proof that negative green exists. They claim it sterilized flies. Could you imagine how easy that would be, like for all of these entomologists who need to, sterilize sheep flies or something? They don't need to get a source of radioactive material to do this. They can just create a pyramid or a pendulum and put them with the flies and it will sterilize them. This sounds like pure fantasy. These are totally dubious claims. They've never been independently verified. This is the absolute weakest form of evidence there is. And my question is, were these guys lying intentionally, or were they self-delusional? That's what I really don't get. I don't believe these stories at all. And that's the only question in my mind. Were they purposely trying to like fool people, or did they really believe what they were saying? Because if they were, that's like self-delusion. All right, well, in summary here, there is absolutely no evidence supporting that negative green exists. And all the evidence that is presented by the founders of the concept goes against it. And I would even add, by extension, people who've extended the concept, it goes against it. I think this concept should be permanently abandoned, and we should never talk about negative green again. This is the end of negative green. I'm done with this concept. If you want to believe in negative green, that's fine, but I think it's absurd. There's no evidence for it. And there is no reason why you should be scared of your pendulum or a pyramid or whatever because of negative green, because it doesn't seem to exist. Anyway, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.